Hello everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I wish I could be with you in person, but in my absence, here is a short presentation titled Electromagnetic Warfare, History and Dangers. So let's begin then with a brief history of electromagnetic warfare. Electromagnetic warfare is defined by the US Department of Defense as, quote, military action involving the use of electromagnetic energy and directed energy to control the electromagnetic spectrum or to attack the enemy. Electromagnetic warfare dates at least as far back as the so-called Moscow signal, which was transmitted into the US Embassy here in Moscow from a building 100 meters away between 1953 and 1976. It involved weak microwave radiation and possibly specialized scalar electromagnetic transmitters, and its original purpose may have been to disrupt US communications and surveillance equipment, or perhaps to connect with a Soviet listening device, or to test US scientists' familiarity with scalar EM, but it became clear that the radiation caused detrimental health effects. For example, multiple ambassadors and embassy staff died of cancer. The US authorities allowed this experiment to continue without informing the embassy staff. Evidently, they were as keen as the Soviets to explore the potential of electromagnetic warfare to, quote, manipulate, change, control, or destroy literally any of the key biological functions of the living system, including mental and behavioral functions. That quote coming from Bearden in 1991. In 1965, according to declassified DoD documents, DARPA launched Project Pandora, a top-secret project to explore the behavioral and biological effects of low-level microwaves. This involved exposing monkeys and unwitting sailors to microwave radiation, along with a host of other unusual experiments. A 2007 Washington Post article seeks to persuade the reader that Pandora led nowhere when it ended in 1970, that the Moscow signal was in fact about eavesdropping and not mind control, and that the military's research into so-called non-thermal microwave effects seemed to die out, at least in the unclassified realm. However, in 1976, the US Naval Surface Weapons Center published an unclassified 172-page bibliography on, quote, biological phenomena and effects and clinical manifestations attributed to microwave and radio frequency radiation, end quote. It contained 3,700 references. The report summarizes ongoing work since 1971 and focuses in particular on the effects of non-ionizing radiation on man at these frequencies. Keywords included in the report are pulsed electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic radiation bioeffects, and health effects. On July the 4th, 1976, the US bicentennial, high-powered Soviet transmitters began broadcasting a rapid tapping sound in the 3 to 30 megahertz band, interfering with communications all over the world. The so-called woodpecker signal continued to be broadcast until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. Theories about the signal's purpose have included behavior modifications by electromagnetic means, entrainment, weather modification, and jamming Western communications. Whatever the true purpose, this 13-year-long program, with its transnational effects, was clearly important to the development of electromagnetic warfare. In 2001, US Congressman Dennis Kucinich introduced the Space Preservation Act of 2001, and he referred to, quote, land-based, sea-based, or space-based systems using radiation, electromagnetic, psychotronic, sonar, laser, or other energies directed at individual persons or targeted populations for the purpose of information war, mood management, or mind control of such persons or populations. That bill was struck down, however, in April 2002, following an intervention by the Department of Defense. In 2002, the US Air Force was granted a patent, shown here, for which it had first filed in 1996, titled Method and Device for Implementing the Radio Frequency Hearing Effect. A frequency transmitted to the head of a receiving subject will, according to the patent, introduce a thermal acoustic signal in the bone-tissue material of the head that replicates the input audio signal and is demodulated by the cochlea to produce nerve signals which are sent to the brain, thus, quote, enabling intelligible speech to be perceived by the brain, end quote. The patent expired in 2016. Long-range acoustic devices, LRAD, can beam sound directly into a person's head, so-called voice-to-skull or V2K technology, either a painfully loud sound that can cause deafness if prolonged, or speech. It has been deployed in numerous contexts, including repelling Somali pirates and putting the, quote, voice of God, end quote, into the minds of terrorists. Between 2002 and 2007, the Pentagon developed two active denial systems, i.e. crowd control weapons that use millimeter waves to produce a sensation of intense heat without causing actual burns. At the time, the limitations of the technology meant, quote, that the ability of the government or anyone else to shoot beams at hundreds of people on city streets, into their homes, and while they travel in cars and planes is beyond improbable. Now, that was from a 2007 news article. However, today that is no longer the case. Havana syndrome, more accurately called non-kinetic brain injury because of the lack of concussion, refers to a cluster of mysterious illnesses allegedly affecting US and Canadian diplomats and their families stationed in Havana, Cuba in 2016. As with the Russian disinformation narrative started in 2016 as a pretext to start censoring certain kinds of online information, i.e. anything contradicting official narratives, Havana syndrome is evidently an attempt to blame official enemies for actions taken much closer to home. Symptoms of Havana syndrome include constant headaches, dizziness, loss of memory and vision, mental disorientation, nausea, insomnia and vertigo. A 2020 report by the US National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine concludes that, quote, directed pulsed radio frequency energy represents the most plausible mechanism for the syndrome. An intelligence study declassified in March 2023 similarly finds that the range of illnesses was most likely caused by, quote, pulsed electromagnetic energy, end quote, that could penetrate buildings using commercial off-the-shelf technology with devices that are easily portable and concealable. A 2018 FOIA request submitted to the Washington State Fusion Center seeking documents related to an investigation into Antifa and white supremacist groups yielded an unexpected result, namely a zip file titled Electromagnetic Effects on Human Body. The zip file included 3 documents. 1. Psychoelectric weapon effects, originating in a 1992 lawsuit brought by former NSA employee John St. Clair Acquay against the NSA, showing the effect of electromagnetic warfare on the human body. His case was dismissed by Judge Stanley Sporkin as frivolous. 2. A diagram of unknown origin on, quote, the bioelectromagnetic field, which is unique for every human body, producing a radar-detectable signal frequency ID based on modulation human brainwaves, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, etc. And 3rd, a diagram, again origin unknown, of remote mind control operations conducted through mobile phone networks and mobile psychotronic weapons carriers disguised as communications vehicles and black helicopters. Why, in 2018, was the Washington State Fusion Center, a counterterrorism organization, holding multiple files on electromagnetic warfare, including from a lawsuit that was thrown out 26 years earlier? The only reasonable inference is that electromagnetic warfare tactics were still deemed relevant for so-called counterterrorism purposes. I'd like now to talk a little bit about targeted individuals. Despite the attempt by a former CIA operative to characterize all Havana Syndrome attacks as being against US officials by the Russians, and despite the US Government Accountability Office recognizing only, quote, US government employees and family members as victims of the attacks, it is evident that such attacks have been perpetrated against innocent civilians around the world for decades. For example, by 2007, websites dedicated to electronic harassment and gang stalking had appeared in India, China, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, Russia, and elsewhere. Given the US government's notorious history of experimenting on its citizens without their informed consent, for instance by spraying civilian populations with biowarfare agents, or by conducting thousands of human radiation experiments for which President Clinton later apologized, it is reasonable to assume, as Weinberger did in 2007, that if the DoD could, quote, develop mind control or long-distance ray weapons, it almost certainly would, and once developed, the possibility that they might be tested on innocent civilians could not be categorically dismissed, end quote. When one understands the relevant history, the testing of electromagnetic weapons on innocent civilians should not be dismissed as implausible. Rather, it is to be expected. As Catherine Austin Fitts has argued, targeted individuals represent, quote, the prototypes, end quote, on which to try out new experimental technology. The disturbing implication is that once the technology has been successfully tested, it will be deployed across the whole of society, presumably to target dissidents. Marshall Thomas understood this back in 2007. Quote, once the weaponry has been perfected on these few thousand people, the same techniques will be applied en masse to humanity as a whole. So if we fast forward then to the COVID-19 era, according to the UK Ministry of Defence's integrated operating concept, quote, home is no longer a secure sanctuary whence we may choose to launch interventions unhindered. Away is no longer a regional horizon, but a global one, involving space and the electromagnetic spectrum. Thus, war is now being openly waged within what used to be considered the domestic arena using electromagnetic means. In keeping with Fitz's dictum that control today is one person at a time, we're not so much dealing with an attempt to use electromagnetic warfare to manipulate the population en masse, say through the worldwide broadcasting of a woodpecker signal, but rather with electromagnetic attacks targeting specific individuals. What might once have seemed like an unproductive investment of resources, for instance setting up vehicles outside victims' homes to broadcast electronic warfare signals, no longer appears that way when we consider recent technological developments which have not only yielded phased array beamforming capabilities, as in 5G networks, but also syringe injectable intracorporeal bio-nano networks capable of communicating with an external network. In 2019, DARPA contracted the company Battelle, a science and technology development firm, for its next generation non-surgical neurotechnology program. This would involve, quote, bidirectional brain control technology interfaces that can be introduced into the body via injection and directed to a specific area of the brain via magnetoelectric signals. When Duke University professor Nita Farhani advocated at the World Economic Forum for, quote, a massive shift from wearables to implanted brain technology, end quote, she evidently did not understand that such technology will allow human brains to be targeted as precisely as individual smartphones are by 5G. Developments since 2020, involving the mass rollout of 5G and soon 6G, and the mass injection of populations with substances containing a cocktail of undisclosed ingredients, including an array of rare metals, are deeply troubling in this context. For if Steele is correct that, quote, after the COVID-19 vaccine technology is injected into the body, the target acquisition of wetware is far more precise, then in principle, everybody starts to look like a potential TI. Final section on remote control of human bodies. The idea of remote-controlled human beings has been around since at least MKUltra subproject 119 in 1960, which was interested in the, quote, recording, analysis and interpretation of bioelectric signals from the human organism and activation of human behavior by remote means. In 1966, Rodriguez Delgado, funded by the CIA through the Office of Naval Intelligence, was able to halt a charging bull using remote-controlled electrical stimulation of the brain. He was also able to make a chimpanzee become, quote, quieter, less attentive and less motivated, end quote, by using a stymosiever to cause a sensation of pain when certain amygdala signals were detected. In his book Physical Control of the Mind, Delgado predicts that new technology will, quote, provide the essential link from man to computer to man with a reciprocal feedback between neurons and instruments, which represents a new orientation for the medical control of neurophysiological functions. Fast forward to 2012, and behold the front cover of this book, edited by Pentagon neuroscience advisor James Giordano. Here, the brain is attached to a joystick, as in a video game. There is no medical function, just direct control. The following year, Israeli scientist Ido Bachelet gave a presentation on the syringe injectable nanorobots developed by his team, each one equipped with an antenna and an IP address. Bachelet stated, quote, to make sure we don't lose control of the nanobots after they're injected, the controller actually links those nanobots to the network like an Xbox. Given that the so-called PlayStation mentality has been linked to excessive, in inverted commas, collateral damage in drone warfare, it is disturbing that biodigital technologies capable of connecting human brains and bodies to the internet were immediately conceived of in video game terms. According to retired Professor of International Political Economy Kees van der Pijl, the possibility of vaccination as neurological remote control must now be taken seriously for, quote, after achieving access by vaccination to the biomass of the 7 to 8 billion individuals who have to be controlled, remote controlling them is no longer an absurd fantasy, end quote. Curie and Brody, in a 2022 article, recognised that the COVID vaccines could have been intended as, quote, a delivery system for the global hardware necessary to roll out the fourth industrial revolution technologies, such as the Internet of Bodies, human-machine and brain-web interfaces. Certainly there must have been some reason for the aggressive worldwide push that resulted in a reported 5.55 billion people receiving experimental technologies into their bodies. A manufactured public health crisis was not it. Or, if the COVID injections were part of a worldwide military experiment intended to calibrate the tolerance of different groups of people to different levels of whatever was in the shots, then the worst may still be to come in the scientifically illiterate, quote, era of pandemics, end quote, that the ruling class expects us to believe is coming. If the transnational ruling class is indeed seeking to gain remote control access to the brains and bodies of the population, the implications do not bear thinking about. In his 2030 scenario, Ray Kurzweil in 2005 anticipated that, quote, nanobot technology will provide fully immersive, totally convincing virtual reality. Thus, if the nanobots remain inactive, we experience real reality, but if we want to experience virtual reality, the nanobots suppress all sensory inputs and replace them with signals that the brain experiences, quote, as if they came from your physical body, end quote. But here's the terrifying part. Kurzweil continues, quote, you could decide to cause your muscles and limbs to move as you normally would, but the nanobots would intercept these interneuronal signals, suppress your real limbs from moving, and instead cause your virtual limbs to move, end quote. Thus, anyone with a, in inverted commas, joystick could effectively paralyze a victim and destroy their sense of reality. I have been told by a retired professional who worked with nanobot researchers for many years that the end game is quote, likely to be worse than death because victims will be made prisoners in their own bodies, end quote. Or a person's nervous system could be hijacked and their actual limb movements controlled, much like the so-called remote control cyborg beetle. Could such a thing ever be attempted in humans? DARPA's ElectRx program manager, Doug Weber, claims that the peripheral nervous system is the body's information superhighway. But as the Snowden leaks first revealed publicly in 2013, the internet allowed the NSA backdoor access into everyone's personal computers. The Internet of Bio-Nano Things could allow the deep state backdoor access to everybody's bodies. It is disturbing in this context that human beings are now being portrayed as hackable animals, and that Moderna claims to be hacking the software of life. Remote control torture becomes a possibility. As Kuiper recognized in 2003, quote, nanotechnology could theoretically be used to make mind control systems, invisible and mobile eavesdropping devices, or unimaginably horrific tools of torture, end quote. According to a 2008 Defense Intelligence report, quote, the concept of torture could be altered by products in the neuroscience market, end quote. In 2019, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Niels Melzer received numerous reports of electronic torture and forms of torture involving, quote, medical implants and, conceivably, nano or neurotechnological devices, end quote. In the era of AI, John Hawkins envisages a scenario where, quote, leftists are summarily rounded up, Pol Pot style, and fitted with devices that read and torment and control their minds. In the context of an electromagnetic weapons system, possibilities are opened up for remote control assassination, allowing dissidents to be quickly and effectively eliminated in a way that is targeted, asymmetrical, and traceless. All dissidents could be quickly and efficiently eliminated in an AI-powered version of what Van der Pale calls the information liquidation model. So in conclusion, the history of electromagnetic warfare teaches that experiments in electromagnetic warfare date back at least 7 decades. EW technologies have become more sophisticated over time. It is evident that civilians have been experimented on using those technologies. New developments in beamforming technologies, coupled with the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, allow for electromagnetic warfare to be targeted precisely at individuals. This potentially allows for remote control torture and assassination, and therefore the public needs to understand the danger and take action before human bodies are absorbed into an AI-powered global information grid. Thank you.